What's going on, YouTube? So today I wanted to do my top 25 going into week 9 of the college football season. So for the slate of games we had in week 8, it was a pretty good turnout. I actually really enjoyed week 8. It was a pretty good week in college football for what the slate of games was. So move on to my 5 outside. So 5 I've got BYU, 4 Wisconsin, 3 USC, 2 Texas A&M, and then 1 North Carolina. So it's tough to see any of these teams as valid top 25 teams just from their resume so far. Normally, I like to throw one of the teams that's not in the AP top 25 into the AP top 25, or into my top 25 each week. But I think really the only team that's deserving right now is North Carolina. Just go through them individually. BYU just played Wagner. Yeah, they beat them really bad, but BYU still has 2 losses, still has a little bit of work to do to get back into the top 25. Wisconsin had a good win against Illinois, but they still do have 2 losses to do. Granted, at this point, 2 top 10 teams, top 11, I think, for Iowa. But I just don't think that Wisconsin's strong enough to make it back in the top 25 yet. They don't really have an identity yet. They don't have one player that's been able to lead them to a big victory so far. Stave hasn't been consistent enough. They haven't had a running back that's been consistent enough. The defense has been pretty good, but again, not consistent enough either. So move on to USC. So the toughest team to figure out this year, just absolutely, I'd say, outmatched Utah with talent. Now USC, I've been saying the entire year, has enough talent to compete with any team in the country, but with Sark at the helm, I didn't think that they were going to be able to make it. And with a new coach, I do think that they're doing better now. I don't think that, coach they have now is the coach for the future, but USC is headed in the right direction. So Texas A&M, tough to figure them out again. Rough last 2 weeks. Chad Kelly had a good week against them this past week, and that was right after they got dismantled by Alabama. So the last one, North Carolina. I don't know who North Carolina. Oh, North Carolina's only lost to South Carolina, and obviously that looks pretty bad now. But North Carolina has had this problem the last couple of years where they just cannot beat South Carolina. So I think that's more of just a mental thing for them. They've been looking very impressive since that win. I believe they won 6 straight, and they look like they are maybe even a contender in the ACC. So move into the top 25. So at 25, I got Mississippi State. Dak Prescott had a huge performance last week. I believe he had 3 passing touchdowns, 3 rushing touchdowns. Looked like genuine Dak Prescott. I do believe that Mississippi State is a team that I don't know if they'll upset anyone just because you know what you'd expect to get from them every week. They will give every team a game that they play. They're going to be a tough out every time, but I just don't know if they have that it factor that they can upset any teams. If you watch Mississippi State, you probably know what I'm talking about. Just because outside of Dak Prescott, they really don't have much. But I still do genuinely believe he is one of the best quarterbacks in the country. So move on to 24, Pitt. So, Pittsburgh right now is a 1-loss team where their only loss is, again, to Iowa. And that Iowa game could have gone either way. Pittsburgh could easily be in Iowa's position right now if Iowa hadn't nailed that, it was like 57, 58-yarder to win the game. And, I think Pittsburgh, like I said with North Carolina, I think they could be a low-key contender in the ACC. So move on to number 23, UCLA. So UCLA has been as inconsistent as Josh Rosen allows him to be this year. So the team does have a lot of talent around Rosen, and if he has a big game, then I think UCLA does too. I don't think he's gotten all the inconsistencies out of the way. A lot of people think he has. I think he's going to get more steady as the season goes along, but I don't think you'll really see until maybe the latter half of his sophomore year that he can really develop into a giant star in college football. He is a great player. He's a great quarterback. He can lead UCLA to beat anyone in the country, obviously, as you guys saw last week against Cal. But they still will. I think they're still going to have problems with teams like USC. So move on to number 22, Duke. So Duke has had as many close victories as anyone in the ACC this year. They do have a very, very good opportunity to win out this year. It's going to be interesting to see in their Miami game this week what Miami team actually shows up. Miami's looked great at times this year, and then they've also looked terrible like they did this past weekend against Clemson. I think it all depends on what head coach they end up hiring. It's going to be a wild week for Miami, and Duke's chances for the ACC Coastal title really depend on it. So move on to number 21, Temple. So Temple's got, to be honest, maybe the biggest game in their history. I believe it's a home game this week, and College Game Day will. I don't know if they've announced College Game Day yet. I'm not sure, so I haven't seen it yet. But I believe it's probably going to be there. I don't think that Temple has the talent to match up with Notre Dame. Notre Dame's just so talented, even with the injuries they have. But Temple's been looking very good this year. They were able to overcome a pretty good East Carolina team last Thursday. I think their defense is for real, but their offense is a little bit of a struggle. So I move on to number 20, Ole Miss. Again, another team that's hard to figure out this year. I think that they don't have enough offensive support around Chad Kelly and Laquan Treadwell to be a consistent contender in the SEC West. Granted, right now, who are their two losses to? Obviously, they have one to Memphis. I can't put my finger. Florida. So they do have two losses. They are a one-loss team in the SEC West. They do control their own destiny along with LSU. That's going to be a big game between them and LSU. I think it'll be very entertaining. I don't think it's going to be a blowout like a lot of people will probably anticipate it to be. I think that could be actually a really good game. Ole Miss, while I do think they're out of the playoff right now completely, they do still have a chance for the SEC West title. So move on to number 19, Toledo. So Toledo, I genuinely believe can go undefeated this year very easily. The problem is when you've beaten... They do have I think their most impressive victory is against Auburn, or not Auburn, Arkansas, just because Arkansas is starting to pull out some good wins now. But the fact that it took triple overtime, or it was either double or triple overtime for them to beat Iowa State, doesn't look too good for them. I don't think the out-of-conference resume is there for them to be able to make the playoff, but I do think that they could be a top 10 team by the end of the season. So move on to number 18, Florida State. So Florida State probably I think they took as big a tumble as anyone besides Utah. So Florida State had just kind of an unlucky game against Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech, I think, was just waiting for the right moment. Big win for them this year, and basically a horrible season for what was supposed to be a huge season for Georgia Tech. They stopped, I believe it was a 3 or 4 game losing streak, and were able to get a huge win against huge win with a blocked field goal against Florida State. I genuinely believe that Florida State was going to win that game big, but Georgia Tech proved me wrong. So move on to number 17, Houston. So this Houston-Memphis game is stacking up to be probably the biggest non-Power 5 game of the year. Basically the biggest Group of 5 conference game. I think that, to be honest, I think the only Group of 5 team that has a chance of making the playoff right now is Memphis. I think that Houston could insert themselves maybe as a dark horse, and if a lot of things happen inside the top 10, a lot of teams start losing, and a lot of teams, basically the top of conferences inside the Power 5 start cannibalizing themselves, then maybe. But for the time being, Houston is a very talented team with a very talented quarterback and has a chance to win a conference that actually stacks up with the lower half of the Power 5 conferences. So move on to number 16, Michigan. So it's hard to place Michigan right now. They are the highest ranked two-loss team for good reason. Obviously, the loss to Utah doesn't look fantastic now, but the Utah game is a separate thing. That Michigan State game was a rough game for Michigan. I do think that they can still compete with anyone in the country. And I believe I saw the line for the Michigan-Minnesota game was Michigan by like 12.5 this weekend. I think people are overreacting to the way that Michigan State game ended. I think that Michigan is still a tremendous team and one of the best inside the Big Ten. So move on to number 15, Memphis. So this is another one of the hardest teams to place right now. Just because you want to put them inside the top 10 just because of their resume. But you look at the teams, Utah. You look at the teams right above them, like Utah, Oklahoma State, Iowa, Stanford, Notre Dame, and you just don't really have the confidence to say that Memphis could beat all those teams right now. It's just one of those things where, like I said, you want to put them ahead, but there's a little bit of hesitation also because they're not a Power 5 team. So move on to number 14, Utah. So again, another team that took a huge tumble after this past week. Like I said, they just got outmatched by USC. USC was a team that was waiting to showcase their talent against a big team like Utah, and I think that finally happened. Utah was just it was an unfortunate time for them. Travis Wilson played a pretty bad game. Devontae Booker didn't look great. Obviously, the defense didn't play great either. But Utah is still a contender inside the Pac-12, but I do think that their playoff hopes are kind of dashed. So move on to number 13, Oklahoma. So Oklahoma's been honestly on a tear since that Texas loss, beating Texas Tech this past weekend, 63, I believe it was 63-27, and then beating Kansas State 55-0. So honestly, they have just wiped out two decent opponents, and their offenses look dominant. The running game's back. The defense is looking better. And I do still think that they are a contender inside the Big 12. A lot of people are saying that they could play spoiler, but they probably won't win the conference. I think they can compete with anyone. I honestly think at this point they'll, especially having TCU at home, I think that they can end up finishing inside the top 10 this year. So move on to number 12, Florida. So Florida is a team that is still very much relevant in the SEC. I think that if Treon Harris is able to get just a little bit better at quarterback, the defense comes through, then I think Florida can actually have a chance to win the SEC this year. I do think they're still there. I do think that they are still very much alive in the college football playoff picture. They had a very, very close loss to a very good LSU team. So to be honest, if that's their only loss right now, especially with the way they blew out Ole Miss, it can come back to look like a pretty good victory now. Like I said, they're still relevant inside the SEC picture and the college football playoff picture. So move on to number 11, Oklahoma State. So big win against Kansas in a pretty sad weekend here at Oklahoma State. I'm assuming a lot of people heard about it. 4 people dead, a lot of people hospitalized in the homecoming parade accident. But in all honesty, they responded very well. They beat a very, very, very bad Kansas team by a lot. J.W. Walsh looked good. That red zone package with J.W. Walsh and then having Mason Rudolph drive them down the field looks great. Now, the one thing that's obviously concerning is the fact that against Kansas, they did run for over. I think they rushed for over 150 yards, and the running backs probably had more than 20 yards, or not 20 yards to carry, more than 4.5 or 5 yards per carry on average. But even against Kansas, the offensive line was struggling. It was kind of sad to watch. The pass blocking was a lot better, and honestly, that hasn't been much of an issue this year. It's the run blocking. They can't get a push, and against teams like Baylor, TCU, OU, that's going to start becoming a real problem. So move on to number 10, Iowa. So Iowa's setting themselves up very, very well to have a Big Ten Conference Championship berth. I think that they will win out. They do have a very winnable game against Maryland this weekend. That win against Northwestern is looking pretty good now it's coming back to look pretty good now since Northwestern was able to respond and beat Nebraska. But I think this Iowa team, I think that game at Nebraska could be kryptonite, but really I think that's their biggest test left on the schedule. So move on to number 9, Stanford. So Stanford is looking great. Since that Northwestern loss, they've been on fire. They were able to take care of Washington over the weekend. They were able to have a very good offensive effort against a very good defensive team. So, Stanford is obviously in the driver's seat right now for the Pac-12. Really, the only team that's going to compete with them is UCLA. So, and they already knocked out UCLA. So I don't know. I don't know if there's any team that will compete with them. They are very much. Not only they are live in the Pac-12 race, but they are by far the favorites right now. They're also they got a lot of momentum riding. If they can win out this year, including winning the Pac-12 championship, then I do think that they will be in the college football playoff. So move on to number 8, Notre Dame. So Notre Dame had, I believe they had a bye week this past week. But anyway, they move into one of their bigger games this year against Temple, probably their biggest game against a non-Power 5 team. And their only loss this year has been to Clemson, and to be honest, that loss right now is looking great because they did almost win that game in Clemson in terrible conditions. And, the fact that they've been able to overcome the amount of injuries they've had, CJ Prosise has been a great running back this year. Deshaun Kaiser has been able to step in and fill Malik Zaire's shoes, if not better than Malik Zaire could have even worn them. So, they had a bye week last week. So I do think that Notre Dame is a team that is definitely slotted in a firm spot to be in the college football playoff contention picture right now. And, if they can beat Temple this week, especially if they can blow them out, which I don't think is going to happen, but if they can get a decent win against Temple this week, then I think that shows that Notre Dame might be the best one-loss team in college football right now. So move on to number 7, Alabama. So they had a close game against Tennessee. Now, I think that's a lot of people have called me a Tennessee homer this year, but I really do believe that they could just as easily be 7-0 as they are 3-4 right now. Every loss they've had has been unbelievably close. And like I said, I think the loss this past weekend says more about Tennessee than it does about Alabama. Alabama honestly had a pretty clutch game. Derrick Henry's been great for them this year. Coker didn't look great, yes. The defense played pretty well. Calvin Ridley played pretty well too. I think that Jay Coker's just Blake Sims all over again. Alabama's I think they're gonna keep winning. They're as alive in the SEC West as anyone else. And yeah, not much to say about it. Just able to escape with a win, which was good for Alabama. So number 6, TCU. TCU with Seth Russell out now kind of inserts themselves as a co-favorite to win the Big 12 again. Now, I think they'll have a big win this weekend against West Virginia. I think West Virginia can continue the slide that they're on because the game is in Fort Worth. Now, TCU, I think obviously the next big game for TCU is when they play Oklahoma State in Stillwater on November 7th. So as long as they can take care of West Virginia this weekend, I think they're good headed into their big slate of November games. So move on to number 5, Michigan State. So I thought the Michigan State-Indiana was going to be a really close game. It was not. Connor Cook's been great the last couple of weeks, showing these, if not the best, one of the best quarterbacks in college football. Showing that he's also a firm Heisman contender. Kind of inserted himself back into the top 5 Heisman race. So Michigan State for the time being looks great. This Ohio State matchup looks like it's going to be everything it's been built up to be this year. And Michigan State looks like they're, like I said, firmly back inside the college football playoff picture. So move on to number 4, Baylor. So Baylor actually had a kind of close game against Iowa State. Combination of a couple things. One, just offense wasn't able to get as good a push as they have this year. And then 2, Seth Russell going down. 3, Iowa State actually had some pretty good play out of their backup quarterback. So it's hard to think of what Baylor's going to be able to do now. Jarrett Stidham has been great when he's actually been able to play this year, but it's hard to think of anyone that's been able to be as effective for any team as Seth Russell has been for Baylor this year. I don't know if he's going to be able to return from a neck fracture, but Baylor has a huge slate of November games, which includes a road game at TCU, which is looking tough now because it is in Fort Worth, and I've been saying the entire year that I still think Baylor can overcome it, but it is going to be a really, really close game this year since it is in Fort Worth, and TCU is just unbelievably good at home compared to how they are on the road. They still have to go into Stillwater. They still have to play OU. So 3 incredibly tough games to play, especially for a freshman quarterback heading into a huge November slate. So move on to number 3, LSU. So I believe that Western Kentucky game was going to be a lot closer than it actually was. Impressive win for LSU. Kind of Brandon Harris has been showing that, if LSU needs him to be, to get 200 yards and 2 touchdowns in a game, he can actually do it. Obviously, Fournette continued to be great. That defense has been stepping up great as well. And I think LSU is, I wouldn't say far and away, but pretty heavily looking like the SEC favorite for now. This LSU-Bama game is going to be huge, though, on, I believe it's also November 7th. So, move on to number 2, Clemson. So, Clemson had as impressive a win as anyone had this past weekend. Now, obviously, it was more due, I can't say it was more due to Miami's just faults with their own team, but the fact that you can actually beat a pretty talented Miami team, which you were favored by 6.5 points by 58. Yeah. To me, that's enough to insert you as the number 2 team in the country right now. Has been as impressive as anyone in the country right now. The only team to beat a good Notre Dame team so far this year. So I do think Clemson is setting themselves up very well as clear ACC title favorites right now. Obviously, they still have to work their way through. Honestly, I think what could be a trap game this week against NC State. NC State has proved spoiler before 2 teams that look like the far and away ACC title favorite. NC State is a very good team this year, too. So I believe that, coupled with the Florida State game, will be challenges for Clemson. But if they can overcome those 2, then and obviously overcome the ACC title game, they're in the college football playoff, if not the number 1 seed. So move on to number 1, Ohio State. So I think Ohio State has it figured out now. Now, I don't want to say that and then have them just implode, or not implode, but go back to the way they were looking at the beginning of the season, but they're looking great under JT Barrett right now, looking like the way they were at this time in the season last year with JT Barrett at quarterback. He's taken the reins. He's been very good. They had a huge 49-7 win over Rutgers. Granted, it is Rutgers, but the fact that Ohio State's pulling away from teams that are bad to mediocre is showing that they're doing what they're supposed to. They're still the number one team in the country for me, as I've said every week since. There's been a couple people that are saying really any team in the top 6 right now, I guess you could make some case they're number one, but Ohio State I think still has by far the strongest. So yeah, that's my rankings for that's my top 25 heading into week 9. So there's really not a whole lot of marquee matchups until week 10, but if this whole season's been an indication, there's going to be some type of massive upset coming into this weekend. I do think it's a little better slate of games than this past weekend. Clemson, NC State could be a huge game. Georgia, Florida games this week. If Georgia can find some type of running game that resembled what they had with Nick Chubb, then they're going to give Florida a huge battle. Obviously, it's a rivalry game. And then obviously Notre Dame Temple, I think, will be incredibly entertaining this weekend. So like I said, pretty decent slate of games this weekend heading into a huge week 10. So yeah, I'll come back soon with my college football predictions for week 9. But yeah, that's pretty much it. See ya.